Oh, you stole a little bit of my thunder because I was going to start by talking a little bit about Simple. So some of you may know me as the co-founder of Simple. Josh Reish, my co-founder, and I started up Simple back in 2009. And our vision was to build a new type of bank, simple, easy to use, customer friendly, something that actually helped customers solve their problems, and their problems were all about how to spend smarter and save more. It wasn't about balance sheets or compliance, which is what banks usually worry about. And as part of that journey, we both quit our jobs in early 2010, raised some money, and started actually trying to build this. And it actually took us 2.5 years from quitting our jobs to actually launching Simple. And most of that 2.5 years, and actually 2 rounds of financing. And most of that time was spent in actually cobbling together all the pieces that would allow us to actually power the interface that we wanted to build. I still remember in, I think it was early 2010, we were talking to technology vendors, bank technology vendors who were trying to sell us some of their technology. And we talked to one sales guy, and at the end of it, we were like, okay, that's cool. Can you send us your APIs? And he looked at us and asked, what's an API? And I was just flabbergasted. We were like, you are a salesman for a technology company and you don't know what an API is? But that was the state of banking technology back then. There was no such thing as APIs or an API platform. So if you wanted to build a fintech startup, you kind of had to build your own. And that took us a long time. We launched in 2012, grew rapidly, and in 2014 we were acquired by BBVA. And a few months after that, I was in Madrid meeting with some of the top executives, and one of them mentioned, oh yeah, we have this idea that we should build an API platform. And I was like, yes, you should do that. Because if that had existed in 2010, it wouldn't have taken us 2.5 years. We could have launched Simple in 6 months, and then we would have spent a lot more money on product market fit rather than trying to figure out how to do reconciliation and settlement between different payment systems. So that was the original thing that got me sort of super excited by this opportunity, and through a process of saying, yes, I'll be an advisor, and yes, and now I'm running it. APIs are sort of a very new thing in banking. It seems to be like the latest buzzword now after blockchain, or maybe along with blockchain. But it's not something that's new in the technology world. Perhaps the best example of what an API platform can be and how massively transformational it can be is Amazon's web services. AWS was launched in 2006, and when it was launched, a lot of people thought it's like a weird thing for a e-commerce retailer to be becoming a technology vendor, and that too with all this cloud computing stuff. The thing is that Amazon actually knows a lot about how to build technology platforms online at scale. They had to do it. They were one of the original companies that got to hundreds of millions of users and got to web scale, and they had to learn how to do it well. And then they said, hey, you know what? Others need these services too. Let's open up our platform and let other people use what we use internally. And that started off as a small business in 2006, and in 10 years, it's grown to the point where it's now $9 billion in revenue. And 1/3 of all internet users use an AWS-powered site every day. One question, how many of you here have actually used AWS either directly or at a company that you are working at? Well, there you go. And that's kind of the power of an API platform when it's done right. Before I go into sort of the description of the BBVA's vision of the open API platform, I want to sort of put it in context of what BBVA is doing globally. BBVA is a very large bank. We operate in 9, 10 countries globally, Spain, the US, and most of Latin America. And just like everybody else, we have a bunch of strategic priorities. The one that's kind of where the open platform sits is in what's the new business models. And that's really the responsibility of the group that I'm part of called New Digital Businesses. New Digital Businesses, if you can go to the next slide. Yep. New Digital Businesses, really what we're doing at NDB is building the future, right? There's BBVA is a large traditional bank, and there's a lot of work going on to do sort of sustaining innovation. But what we are all about disruptive innovation, and we look at that along sort of 4 dimensions. One is just internal incubation. My team was one of the internal ventures that was incubated and is now a full-fledged unit. But we have lots of others. We also do strategic partnerships, including with Dwolla and with On Deck Capital. Both of them are startups based in the US. And then we also do a bunch of digital M&A and investments. Perhaps the most famous here in the UK is our investment in Atom Bank. But also, we acquired Simple, we recently acquired Holvi, and we have done other deals as well. And then finally, there's a venture capital arm, which is Propel. What's interesting thing about the open platform is that it supports all of these. And what it really allows each of these businesses to do is to get to market and build an experience much more rapidly than they could have otherwise. If you think of the world, well, maybe 15 years ago, before AWS came along, you could go out and start a website, and if you needed to, you could provision servers in a data center somewhere, and it took a lot of time, and you had to buy hardware sometimes, and it took a bunch of upfront capital. And then if someday you suddenly had 50,000 people show up on your website, well, your website crashed, because there's no way you could deal with that. And if you worried about it, you'd massively over-provision. What AWS really allowed startups and innovators, and now pretty much everybody to do, is to trade upfront capital for variable cost. And with that just means that you can try out so many more experiments, you can do so many more things with much less upfront investment. So that's kind of the power of open APIs, and it's not just about AWS. The technology world is all about platforms now. In fact, this is a great quote from a guy called Steve Yegg. Basically, it's not enough to build a product anymore. If you build a product and you do just that, you're going to go out of business. You eventually, any product, no matter how good it is, will be replaced by an equivalent product with a platform attached. And you can see this. I mean, Facebook, I guess it got to maybe its first 100 million customers, but then they built Facebook Connect. And there's also Twitter Connect, LinkedIn Connect, and sort of every other OAuth-based API out there. There's obviously Salesforce on the business side has an amazing platform as well. And although we don't necessarily think of it in the same way, the Android and both the iPhone are also actually platforms as well. The BBVA Open Platform is pretty much the same thing, but in the financial services world. What we allow startups to do is to sort of use the capabilities they need that we do well, things that we as a bank kind of have to do, hold money, move money, make loans, KYC, compliance, risk, that sort of stuff is things we do every day. We have to. We do it at a fairly decent scale. We allow startups to sort of use that capability and then use it to build an experience that that they want to provide to customers. One example might be a money transfer company that connects into our APIs and then moves money on behalf of their customers and our customers. Who are our customers? Well, right now we're running a fairly small alpha. We have about 150 people in that alpha in Spain and in the US, and most of them are small fintech startups. But that isn't the whole story. I mean, AWS started the same way. It was mostly small startups that were using them in the early days. Now they power like 2 or 3% of the internet's traffic, and I believe even the CIA uses AWS and runs on them. And we expect to see the same thing. The innovation doesn't just happen in the startup world, it's just that a lot of it happens in the startup world. I expect that we'll have much larger companies and even internal ventures that will be using the open platform. What are the services that we currently provide? Well, there's BBVA Connect. I think another speaker actually asked this question. So you all must have used Facebook Connect. BBVA Connect is exactly the same thing, an OAuth-based API. It gives you a token that on behalf of a customer. With that, you can access the customer's profile information, the number of accounts, the transactions there, card information, and then you can also make money transfers on their behalf. Another interesting API that we have is the PayStats API. This is an aggregated big data API. In Spain, I think we do sort of 15% of all transactions. So this is actually quite useful if you want to know sort of what's the average restaurant meal ticket in, say, Barcelona. You can actually figure that out from our data. And there's a bunch of companies looking at that to sort of help businesses inform decisions about where to open stores and things like that. Moving right along, current customers, which I can actually publicly announce, are just these two. Simple, my startup is actually built on the open platform, and it took a while to sort of transition, but now all of Simple's customers are on BBVA. Duola is another interesting startup you guys may have heard of. It's a money transfer startup based in the US, and you can use them to move money. In fact, they actually compete in that particular way with BBVA in the US. Of course, you can also, if you're a BBVA customer, you can move money with us as well. But we're totally okay with that. And the last thing, before I move on to questions, I wanted to quickly discuss the BBVA Open Talent Competition. You might have seen the name all over the place because we're sponsoring this. Open Talent and Open Platform APIs actually go quite well together, and we hope that a bunch of the startups in the competition will look at using our platform in the future, but you don't have to. You can just come and win, and that's totally okay. One thing I did want to say was that the last date for applications is early next week, so if you're at a startup and you're thinking about it, just do it. And that's all I had.
Thank you, Sharmir. So as a startup guy who's built a business that's had the sort of exit that lots of startup people would love to have, if you were creating a new kind of startup today, where would you be exploring? Where do you see the opportunity with an open door?
Well, I am kind of a fintech guy now, so I really don't know much about things like drones or AI or any of the other areas.
But in finance?
In finance, I think there's still a huge amount of opportunity in almost every area. I mean, there's God knows how many. There's probably 100 payment startups within 10 miles of us here, if not more. But I still think there's a lot of opportunity in payments. I think Hank was talking about Earthport. I remember seeing it was a World Bank estimate that the daily FX trading market is about $4 trillion a day. And that's just so huge, it's unimaginable. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in payments, but it's already a lot of startups doing that, and in many other sectors. If I had to pick one that's really sort of behind the curve in terms of startups going after it, would probably be insurance. I'm actually an angel investor in one insurance startup in the US, and I think people haven't quite caught on to the fact that insurance is just the sort of the flip side of the same risks that you look at in lending, and one way of protecting against them. So I think we'll see a lot more insurtech startups.
I got good news for you, Sharmir. In about 15 minutes, we're launching a session called Reinventing Insurance.
I did notice that. I'm really looking forward to that. And once I'm off stage, I can actually focus on that without worrying about it.
Let me ask you one final question. A lot of the big established organizations are trying to develop the startup mindset, and some of them have their innovation lab, which is over there. Some of them are running incubators. Having come from the startup into the corporate, how do you see the two cultures working together? Can they work together?
They can, and it's in sort of an ongoing cultural transformation / cultural clash, whatever you want to call it. It's not easy, and I think it is the biggest problem that banks face with doing innovation, is just that their corporate structures are set up to have 20 people who have the ability to say no versus one person who has the ability to say yes, and so things just don't happen. And they are risk-averse organizations. I think the way to make it happen is the push really has to come from the top. You really need the chairman and the CEO and the top team to sort of breathe and talk about innovation every single day. And then that kind of trickles down slowly, but it does. And that way BBVA is amazing. Our chairman and CEO, our chairman, who is in his 70s now, was actually a fintech entrepreneur back in the 70s. And so he still has that same mindset. He's been doing it for like 40 years now. Back in '04, he was talking about how the biggest competitors for banks would be Google and technology companies, which people thought he was crazy back then. Now he's being proven right.
He spoke here last year, actually.
He's an amazing guy. And then our CEO is actually an engineer as well. And most of the top team are people with that sort of a background, and who, nobody at BBVA questions innovation. The only question they have is, how do we get ahead of it and how do we take advantage of it?
Well, thank you for joining us. Even though we have commercial sponsors to help make this happen, when we have a speaker on the stage, it's because there's an editorial story we want them to tell.
My pleasure.